Hi, everybody. I can hardly see you for the lights. Anyway, it's really great to be here in San Antonio. I've been to Texas many times. I grew up in New Mexico, Albuquerque, but I'm really not familiar with San Antonio. So I hope I can see some of it. And I'm really glad to see every one of you here because this is such an urgent matter that we're being told again that the people of the U.S. have to support another military adventure. And we're getting another geography lesson. People are like, where is Venezuela? Where was Vietnam? Where was Iraq, Syria, Libya? And it's just for the purpose of we being told that the national interest and national security requires that the U.S. get involved. I was in Yugoslavia in 1999 during the U.S. NATO bombing. I was there 2 times, in the 5th day of the war for 5 days, and on the 54th day of the war for 5 days with Ramsey Clark, who was a very noted human rights attorney, internationalist, anti-imperialist. And that war took months of U.S. media preparation of a humanitarian crisis that they falsified because there was none. And the U.S. was talking about having to save Kosovo from Serbia and the Yugoslavs. And that war destroyed 600,000 jobs. 600 factories were completely bombed. Hundreds, maybe more, of people were murdered by U.S. bombs. And the country disappeared. Yugoslavia is no more. It was balkanized. And that's part of what the U.S. strategy has been in the recent military adventures. They're not really interested in bringing democracy. It's their version of democracy. When Washington and all the presidents talk about democracy, they mean dollar democracy. They mean the right of the capitalist to exploit and take over another country's resources. When we talk about democracy, we say, who does it benefit most? And what they're doing in Venezuela, with their struggle to build socialism, that's their stated objective, is to meet the needs of the people, to provide for everyone in the country using the enormous wealth of Venezuela. Venezuela has, by far, the largest oil reserves in the world, way more than any other country in the Middle East, and they have enormous oil reserves. It has the largest reserves of nickel ore in the world. And nickel ore is a very strategic metal. It has the largest reserves of diamonds in the world. It has bauxite. It has enormous hydroelectric potential. It has great, great water resources. It is an amazingly rich country. And I think it's important to look at the past before Hugo Chavez became president, which was exactly 20 years ago. He was actually inaugurated in February 1999. There's been a great deal of progress for the people in 20 years, but you'll hear sometimes Venezuelan opposition, right-wing people. About 99.9% of the Venezuelans who live in the U.S. are opposition. They're people who had privilege, who had money, who came to the U.S. Because poor and working class Venezuelans generally don't travel to the U.S. to live. But anyway, you'll hear them say, oh, it was so great before Chavez, he's ruined it. It was such a prosperous country. But it was prosperous for the rich. It was prosperous for the prosperous ones. Venezuela has been an oil-producing country for over 100 years. It's been very dependent on the oil. And sometimes they'll say, why doesn't Venezuela diversify? They've tried, and they're trying. But it's a very hard challenge right now. However, it's an issue, it's a situation that has existed for over 100 years, the dependency on the oil. I want to go back to an important date that took place. In 1989, first, for 40 years, from 1958 to 1998, 40 years, 1998 was when Hugo Chavez got elected. But 40 years before Chavez, there was an arrangement, a political arrangement, between the two main capitalist parties, ADECO and COPEI, for short. These two parties were similar to Democrat and Republican, and their pact of 40 years was that they would share power. One would take turns being the president and leading in the Congress, and the other then, it was like back and forth, like the Democrats and Republicans. And nothing really ever changed, except the rich got rich and the poor got poorer, just like here. But in those years of enormous profits for US oil, British, French, Dutch oil companies, the poverty of the people increased greatly. For example, from 1981 to 1986, these were years that were characterized throughout Latin America into the 90s. They were characterized by many of the civilian governments after the dictatorships of the 60s and 70s. Many of those governments basically sold off the wealth of their countries. Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela. They were forced by the international banks, the IMF, the World Bank, and others, in order to keep financing their debt, which grew and grew. They were forced to sell off much of the wealth of the country. And the same thing happened in Venezuela. So the poverty rate as a result of the people not having control of the resources grew. 1981 to 1986. The poverty grew from 21% of the population to 56%. Think about it. That's only 6 years, and it went from 21% to over half the population living in poverty. And then by the late 1990s, it was 80% poverty. In a country awash in oil. Again, the profits left the country, and only some was left for the 1%. So in 1989, the president of that time, Carlos Andrés Pérez, he finally acceded completely to the demands of the IMF, even more. He was resisting a little bit. But in 89, he suddenly raised the essential prices of food, gasoline, all the essentials of the population. And the people exploded in rebellion. It's called the Caracazo, which means basically the rebellion that took place in Caracas, the Caracazo. If you talk to anyone who was alive or conscious, old enough to remember, it was burned into their minds, into their memories, what took place. Because in 1 week of people basically opening the stores to get the food, some would call it looting, I would call it justice. In 1 week's time, from February 27 to March 5, 3,000 people were gunned down in this capital and killed in other parts of the country, but at least 3,000 in the capital. Now, imagine 3,000 people murdered. They were machine gunned by the police, by the army. Carlos Andrés Pérez's forces. What was Hugo Chavez doing? Hugo Chavez. He was a young military man, born in 1954, and he had joined the military at the age of 17, which was often what poor young youth did in Venezuela when they didn't have much of other opportunity. He joined the military. He became an officer. He became very, very skilled in teaching. He became a teacher and a trainer and teacher of history. But he began to teach his soldiers about Venezuela's revolutionary history, the history of Simón Bolívar, of other leaders who fought for the independence from Spanish colonialism. And he was also training in the 1980s, almost a secret army of young men with like-minded thought, of the need to change the situation so that the poor would no longer be poor. And when the Caracazo happened, he and his men decided we have to speed up the process. And so 3 years later, on February 4th, 1992, and it's a date that's really a historic date now in Venezuela. Sadly, of course, he died 6 years ago. And his tomb is on a hillside called the Cuartel de la Montaña. It's a military fortress. And he's buried there, 24-hour guards and an eternal flame. And when you walk up to the hill, there's a tower and the flame and the letters 4F, meaning the 4th of February. The 4th of February, 1992, he and a handful of men in military tanks drove down the streets of Caracas to take on the dictator, Carlos Andrés Pérez. The battle only lasted one day. It was in the rest of the country as well, a few hundred men of Chavez's men, and it lasted one day. By the end of the day, he agreed, he told the government, I will tell my men to put their guns down. I will tell them that it's time to surrender, but I want to do it on TV. So on television, and you can see it on the internet, look it up, 4th of February, 1992, he said to his men and the people of the country, it's my responsibility, I take full responsibility for this action, and I regret that we have to put our guns down for now. And he said to his men, we need to put our guns down. But when he said the words for now, por ahora, it was like a lightning rod because the people were watching. And they said, he said for now. That means he's not done. Well, he received a long prison sentence along with his men. He was put in prison and he was freed 2 years later. What happened? He became such a hero. I mean, imagine this man single-handedly, virtually, with other men, taking on the dictatorship which had murdered so many people 3 years earlier. That he was heroic to the people. And how did he get out 2 years later, even though a long prison sentence? Was because people began to demand free Hugo Chavez. And there was a presidential election the year after he was put in prison, 1993. And some of the presidential candidates would say in rallies, if I'm elected president, I will free Hugo Chavez. And that's what happened. Caldera was the next president, 1993, and he freed Hugo Chavez. Now, it wasn't because he sympathized with him. It was because he was forced to, because the people made it happen. And it's an important lesson for anyone fighting for justice, that it's the people who make anything happen. So that's 92, 93, and the popularity was so great for him. People looked up to him, said he's a leader for us. Was that he ran for president in 1998, 5 years later. And he was elected. He didn't belong to those two bourgeois parties, capitalist parties. He didn't have money. He had no money at all. But he had the people. And when he was elected, it was a shock felt, not only in Venezuela, among the 1%, but in Washington, D.C. Because the U.S. has always had its eye on the wealth of Venezuela. Not just the oil companies, but the Pentagon and the White House. The ruling class of this country knew what it meant for Hugo Chavez to win. The CIA, by the way, had, in the 1970s in Venezuela, assigned this Cuban right-wing terrorist, Luis Posada Carriles, maybe you've heard of him, guilty of many, many murderous crimes against people, on behalf of the CIA. He was sent by the CIA in the 70s to crush the leftist movement of Venezuela. And there's a video documentary that we distribute, but he was responsible while he was in Venezuela, heading up the intelligence police, murdering many young leftists and activists in the country in the 1970s. He was responsible for bombing a Cuban airliner, for paying 2 men to plant bombs on a plane, and when they got off on one of the legs, it was exploded and 73 people died. That was the role of the U.S. in Venezuela before Hugo Chavez. So they were shocked by his victory. And when he took office in 1999, 20 years ago, February, Hugo Chavez put his hand on the Constitution as he took the oath. And he said, I swear on this moribund Constitution, we will have a new one. That very year, there was a new constitution. But the first one of many that they had had, where the people drafted it, having been elected to posts in a constituent assembly, something we're not familiar with because our Constitution is hundreds of years old and it's written in stone as if never to change, used as a club against us many times by the Supreme Court, written by slave owners. But in Venezuela, this was drafted by the people, ratified for the first time in their history by overwhelming majority. The people voted for it. And this constitution, which is the one still in place, said for the first time that the resources of the country belong to the Venezuelan people. The oil, the mineral wealth, the soil, the water, everything belongs to us and not to some exploiter abroad. That equal rights would be guaranteed. Indigenous rights. For the first time, the indigenous were recognized in Venezuela. Of the right to housing, education, and health care. A true guaranteed right. We don't even have that in our Constitution. It's only life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which can mean anything. So that Constitution gave Hugo Chavez the ability and the people the ability to use it to fight for their rights, because it wasn't just a man who could say, this is yours here. It was to create a new society. By 2004, I and many other people from around the world were invited to a special conference that he called. It was in defense of humanity, in which he declared that the objective of the revolution was socialism. Not just revolutionary struggle, but it had a name, socialism. And he called for, interestingly, in that conference, the creation of an alternative media to combat the lies of CNN and all the other media we're familiar with. It's called Telesur. How many of you have seen Telesur? Yeah. That was a result of Hugo Chavez's program, not only for the people of Venezuela, but for all Latin America. In that same year, 2004, he and Fidel Castro signed an agreement. I was very privileged to be there in Havana when they were there in the audience of a theater. When they were in the theater, we were in the audience, witnessing them signing a pact between the two countries called ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. That alliance was premised on the idea that the resources of Latin America, of the group of the countries that joined in ALBA, would share the resources, share the human capital, meaning the skills of people like Cuban doctors and teachers, and create a new integrated economy and a social unity and anti-imperialism. Soon, not only did other countries join, but they joined on the basis of elections that took place in Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, in which leftist socialist presidents were elected. This was a result of what people in Latin America were seeing with the progress taking place in Venezuela. Despite U.S. aggression, so much has happened in Venezuela that the people of Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua said, we want the same thing. So they elected Rafael Correa in Ecuador, new constitution. Bolivia, Evo Morales, the first indigenous leader, a new constitution called the plurinational, meaning all the indigenous peoples equal before everyone, full equality. And Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega. But in addition, many Caribbean nations joined ALBA. It was a major challenge to the U.S. traditional domination, which was intensified after the end of World War II with the formation by the U.S. of the Organization of American States. You've heard of the OAS, the Organization of American States. It's supposed to encompass all the countries of the Americas, North and South. But it doesn't include Cuba, because it is dominated by the U.S. in order to make sure that the U.S. can keep control of what takes place in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so it was in 1962 that the U.S. pressured the other countries to vote and expel Cuba for being, as they said, Marxist-Leninist, which the leadership said they are. And Cuba has never been part of it ever since. Venezuela, 2 years ago, announced that they would be leaving the OAS because it was being used as a club against them. And that's something else we can talk about, but that's the OAS. ALBA was an alternative to that, was a way of showing we don't have to be submissive to U.S. policy. We don't have to owe everything that we have to the banks. We can use our own wealth. That's why in this agreement, Cuba began to send thousands of doctors to Venezuela to provide a free parallel healthcare system for any Venezuelan who wished, for free, as a challenge to the private healthcare system of the country. And the second country that overcame its illiteracy, that engaged in a literacy campaign so that everybody could read and write, was Venezuela. Which was the first country? Cuba, 1961. They wiped out illiteracy. But this is a moral danger to the United States. It's a threat to the U.S. because they can't let this happen. So what happened in 2008? Okay, Correa, Morales, Ortega elected in 2005 and 2006. What happened in 2008? With so much development and progress in Latin America, the major reduction of poverty in Venezuela, reduction of poverty in Ecuador, in Bolivia and Nicaragua, stability, was the presidential election of the United States. You had Barack Obama running as a Democratic candidate. And on May 23rd, 2008, he spoke in Miami. He traveled there for his Latin America speech. This is my policy for Latin America. And interestingly, he was surrounded by Cuban right-wingers. It was a conscious decision to be surrounded by Cuban right-wingers who left after the revolution and have tried ever since then to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. He knew what he was doing. And he gave a very significant speech. Obama said, George Bush ignored Latin America when he was president. He said he was so concentrated on the Iraq and Afghanistan war that he ignored Latin America. And he said, as a result, Hugo Chavez used his checkbook diplomacy to fill a vacuum. And he influenced Nicaragua and Bolivia. And he said, we can't allow that to continue. You see, it's very interesting. Because Obama was also running to represent the interests of U.S. imperialism. That wasn't an accident. By checkbook diplomacy, he was attacking the idea, or the very idea that Venezuela was using its oil wealth for the people. You're not supposed to be providing housing and health care. You're supposed to be allowing the U.S. oil companies to just suck it out of Venezuela. That was what he called the misuse of the oil revenues by checkbook to give it to the people. Now, when the Constitution says that the oil belongs to the people, it doesn't mean that every year they give you 20 barrels each. It's used to create housing and health care and education. In 20 years, there have been 45 universities, colleges, and other institutes of higher learning built, created, and they're free. It's free education. It didn't used to be that way. So you have now at least 2 generations of young people who have hope and opportunity. You have, with the oil revenue of the country, 2.6 million homes built, modern, new. And I visited many of them when I was in Venezuela. I traveled there from February 12 to March 12 in a very intense time when the U.S. was clearly beginning a new war of aggression, economic, military threats, sanctions that are very severe right now. And we'll show some of the video. I have 4 videos to show. They're very short, but I'd like to do that and show the housing project of what they're doing for the people. 2.6 million, but President Maduro has said that the goal in the immediate sense, in the very next years, will be 5 million. That's really about 15 to 20 million Venezuelans who will benefit. And then we'll show the food program. Before we start it, we'll show the food program, the thing that says Venezuelan people resist. And that is to overcome the economic war of the corporations and the U.S. trying to deepen the sanctions. It started 3 years ago because the government for years under Chavez opened and created supermarkets that were subsidized. They would buy enormous amounts of food and then sell it to the population for very, very cheap price to overcome the speculation in the private markets, to overcome the very high inflation and the economic war of the capitalists in the country. The subsidized stores were a problem, though, because what was happening was that anybody could buy in those stores, and so there was a huge amount of theft. There were contraband gangs, black marketeers who were taking enormous amounts of the food and taking it to Colombia, in the western part of the country, bordering Colombia, and selling it there for a profit, gasoline as well. And so 3 years ago, the government, because things were getting more difficult, opened a program called CLAP, C-L-A-P. It's the Local Committees of Supply and Production. And this is where the government delivers to people's homes through the distribution of committees called the communes and communal council. They're neighborhood groups that are becoming more and more empowered to defend the revolution, to carry out the day-to-day work in their neighborhoods. And so it's not just food being brought to your neighborhood, but the people engaged doing the census, making sure that people are taken care of. And so we'll see that video as well, the two. About 9 days ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. is going to unfold a campaign charging Venezuela with using a CLAP program to launder money and to engage in narco-trafficking, and that they're going to shut down the CLAP program. Already, the U.S. government has sanctioned 10 of the 12 ships that deliver the CLAP food from abroad to bring it into the country, which has delayed greatly the delivery of the food. But for the U.S. to now say that they're going to unfold in the next weeks a campaign to shut down and to keep the CLAP food from coming into the country, it's a crime. It's genocide. It's saying we're going to make that part of the population that has a lower income, that the government is trying to make sure is fed on a regular basis so that nobody goes hungry. To target them, that shipment of food is really trying to kill the people. And this is why we're traveling all over the country to let people know, because you will not hear this in the media, except when the Wall Street Journal says that it's money laundering and buys the whole Pentagon line. It's very, very serious. And this is something that the government and the people are working very hard to try to overcome and find out how they can resist every one of these blows. The U.S. has engaged in one attack after another. So I think that for 20 years, the U.S. has attempted to overthrow the Bolivarian revolution, as they call it. First, they overthrew Hugo Chavez for about 72 hours. How many of you are familiar with that in 2002? 2002, the U.S. was plotting. There's definite proof that the U.S. was behind it, but people woke up on April 11, 2002, to turn on the TV, and what they were seeing was cartoons, because the media was controlled at that time by the capitalists, by the opposition to Hugo Chavez. And they turned off programming to have cartoons so you wouldn't know what was really going on. And people found out, the word spread, and tens of thousands of Venezuelans came to Miraflores Palace to rescue Hugo Chavez and bring him back to the presidency. And I remember I told you how Chavez was freed from prison by the people. Well, he was freed again by the people. He was brought back from the coup. Unprecedented. Those of us who were watching in those days, first of all, it was a shock. It was like, it's over. He's overthrown. And then the people brought him back. It was huge. Has never happened before. If anyone can think of an example, let me know. But it hasn't happened before. So it gave the people a sense of their power and enabled Chavez to say, we're going to continue forward. The military, the part of the military that was plotting against him was purged. And since that time, the military, the police, the National Guard has been greatly radicalized. That's why despite Pompeo and Pence and Bolton and Marco Rubio saying that they're talking to military officials and they're going to break away from Maduro and they're going to join the U.S. and help overthrow him, that hasn't happened. They haven't succeeded because the army and all the defense forces of the country are very united. I met with many of them. I met with soldiers. I met with militia people. There's over 2.5 million civilians who are organized as militia. And I met with high officers. And they all talk with a great sense of patriotic duty to defend their country from invasion. You're going to see a little short video of a man who says, I'm not with Maduro, but I'm going to fight to defend my country if there's troops that come in or if we're bombed. But it's a serious situation, sisters and brothers, because it's the U.S. media that's creating the justification for this war. The media is playing the principal role in paralyzing the U.S. population. Now, after Vietnam, there was a great fear among the people, the whole population, of any new wars, any new major wars. So that when the U.S. for 6 months prepared and sent hundreds of thousands of troops to Saudi Arabia and the surrounding Iraq for the first Iraq War, the Gulf War they called it, in 1991, I was one of the organizers with many other people when the Americans were so fearful of a disastrous war like Vietnam that we had marches of 400,000, 200,000. People were just jamming the streets all over the country because the media couldn't justify what was going to happen. But in these years since, the Pentagon and the media has perfected this war of lies. And that's why when the Yugoslavia war that I just mentioned earlier broke out with the bombing, by that time the media had softened up the population and made people think, if you defend Yugoslavia against war, well, you're supporting a dictator, Milosevic. And the night that bombs began dropping for 78 days in Yugoslavia. I'm from San Francisco. We were used to having people come out by the thousands. Only 300 people came out because they thought, well, that's a justified war. And it's very worrisome what's happening today. How many of you have seen anything positive in the U.S. media about Venezuela? Can you cite an article? How many of you have seen articles that the people are starving? How many of you heard that the government is extremely repressive and killing people? On and on and on and on. This chaos is a basket case. It's completely collapsed. Well, what they don't tell you is that the U.S. is doing much of this. The U.S. and the corporations. So there's an interesting fact here about CLAP. The head of it, who is the head of the organizing of this great national project, said that the price that the population pays for the big box of dried goods, which is very considerable, and the chicken, beef, eggs, and the fish that also comes, is 2,800 bolivares for the whole month. It's about 50 cents US dollars. If you buy that food on the private market in those supermarkets that are fancy, I mean, they're like Whole Foods or Safeway or whatever store you have here in San Antonio, it costs 117,000 bolivares. 2,800 versus 117,000. So it's a lie that the people are starving. The government, the socialist government, has provided for the people with housing. Now, the houses are not, they're really basically given away because people buy them, but everybody I talked to bought their house within a year. And they were working class people. They didn't have a lot of money. So it's more of a symbolic price that people pay. Aren't we used to thinking that you're supposed to pay an enormous amount to have a house? Aren't we, how many of you have thought about buying a house? Like, how many of you think you could never buy a house? You know, I like to tell people this. I've lived in San Francisco for 36 years in the same building. It's 10 apartments. Our apartment's 400 square feet, really small. And the 10 apartments are above a big commercial space. And the rent of my husband and I alone has bought that building twice, the 10 units. But if we're 5 days late, we're evicted. And you know in San Francisco, they want to evict you so they can put a millionaire in that apartment. But that's true in the whole country, gentrification. When you see towers like that beautiful tower, that city that I panned, when you see those going up in the United States, it means we're being driven out. Because no working class person can live in them. That's the concept of saying social investment. We're pouring money into building millions of homes, more than what they already have, so that everybody can have a roof over their heads, that it should be as accessible as having a toothbrush, that it should be as absurd to have to pay a landlord for your home as to pay someone for a toothbrush because you couldn't afford it. Every day here's some pennies because I couldn't pay to buy a toothbrush. It's as essential as your clothes. And that's why it's targeted by the U.S. government. That's why they say we have to overthrow Maduro. When did this new aggression start? Last year. Because the new presidential elections were coming up in May. We've already seen in 20 years of Chavismo that out of 23 national referenda, 23 elections, the Bolivarian forces, the revolution, the left, has won 20 of them. And with every one of those, president, parliament, governorship, mayor, all the referenda that has been won by the left has helped the revolution advance. Hasn't been easy. So last May when the elections was coming, the U.S. decided we're not going to allow any more elections to continue under this government, under this system. And they began a campaign to delegitimize the election because they knew that Maduro was going to win. So the U.S. instructed the opposition parties, which they finance and they direct, just like they're directing the puppet Guaido. They told all of them, this is a boycott, nobody is to run, so that only Maduro runs and we can say dictator. He was the only one who ran. Problem was, two of the opposition defied the U.S. and ran for president. One of them, Henry Falcón, the U.S. was actually contemplating sanctioning him, punishing him to keep him from running. He won about 20-something%. Maduro won 67.8%. What did this mean? It means 6 more years of Chavismo, of President Maduro, of progress, of revolution. And that's what the U.S. said, no. So even though he was elected democratically in a in an election system that's been characterized as highly democratic and not subject to fraud, the way it's run. he was inaugurated in January. That's where it began this year. January 10, he was inaugurated, and the media war began. The dictator, illegitimate. January 10, he's inaugurated, and on January 22nd, less than 2 weeks later, Mike Pence, vice president, calls Juan Guaido, an unknown. He never ran for president. Calls him and literally told him on the phone, tomorrow's your day, do it. They already planned this. And on January 23rd, he calls the media and he says, according to Article, I think it was 233 of the Constitution, I am the interim president. I mean, throughout a whole election, he just declares he's president because the U.S. said, we're going to back you. We got you. And what was Article 233 of the Constitution, which the opposition always hated that Constitution, but now they're using it. It was, first of all, a false premise. But it says, in the event that there's a vacancy in the presidency, the National Assembly shall call an interim president if there's a vacancy until an election is held 30 days later. Problem is, there wasn't a vacancy. There was a sitting president, Nicolas Maduro. So that was a complete lie. When you breaking down the media, when you read the media and they say he is constitutionally allowed to be the interim president, false, because there wasn't a vacancy. There was a vacancy 5 years earlier when Chavez was dying of cancer, and he knew he had little time left. So in December, after he had been elected in October 2012, December, 2 months later, he appears on television and he told the people, I'm going to Cuba for more medical treatment. And after a speech, he said, if there's a need for a new presidential election, I ask you, for the unity of our country, for the unity of the revolution, to vote for Nicolas Maduro. Because he knew, dying, that the U.S. would use that advantage to try to split up the country and create chaos. It was a very dangerous moment. I remember when he said he had cancer 2 years before. It was very worrisome. What's going to happen? What's the U.S. going to do? And so he needed to be able to assure that that revolution continued, and that even though they were basically tied up in these elections and dependent on outcomes of elections, he had to assure that the people who supported what they had already done would back Maduro. And they did. He squeaked by, but he won with 50.6% of the vote. Right. Because if he hadn't won, I can't imagine what would have happened. But he had 5 years of progress. Now, that's why they don't want 6 more years, because you're going to see a scene here of a prison that I visited. I visited 4 prisons when I was there in February and March. It's very interesting. So this is what happened. Guaido calls himself president, but he has another problem with that article. What is it? What did I say the other part of it was? Elections in 30 days, which is a joke. He doesn't have the ability to have an election. I mean, think about it. He doesn't have the mechanism. He's one person with a few people protesting, a few thousand. He doesn't have it. He doesn't have the ministries. He's nothing. But what happened 30 days later? The U.S. had to create a diversion. They said, we're going to bring humanitarian aid to the country. How many of you knew of the humanitarian aid? Yeah, that got some news. Because they're starving, because the people are starving. Don't mention that you're starving them on the western part of the border. So I went there. I took a 25-hour bus ride with a lot of people to defend the border. I went to report on it because the people were going to defend their border. And the National Guard was there at 2 bridges. One bridge, I wasn't there. It was a severe, severe battle of 15 hours. Maybe you saw that in the news, where there were the terrorist gangs supported by the U.S. throwing Molotovs all day, rocks, injuring people. It was right in the town because the bridge is there at the edge of town between Colombia and Venezuela. And then the bridge I was on was, again, 15 hours. The Bolivarian National Guard was on either end, about 200 meters away. They were protecting us from these gangs that were trying to break through very violently. It was like the National Guard only had tear gas. They don't have guns. They weren't using guns. And they were trying to just push them back with the tear gas. But the people held strong. The National Guard kept them out. And it was a victory for the Venezuelan people. It wasn't aid and it wasn't humanitarian. That's what a lot of Venezuelans told us. You saw that woman in the CLAP program saying, Trump can eat it himself. Just keep it out. The U.S. said, we're bringing 70 tons of food. And the Venezuelans said, in that region, we deliver 12,000 tons of food regularly, every month. 12,000 tons, not 70 tons. It was a Trojan horse. That's what they told us. So, while we were there for 4 days in Táchira, the state is Táchira, it's a state that's characterized by a lot of contraband. I told you, the theft of all the subsidized goods of the country are taken to the border to sell in Colombia. And you know, they don't tell you about the thousands of people who've been killed in Colombia. From the death squads, the paramilitaries, the government. That is a repressive government. And it's an ally of the U.S. against Venezuela. They don't tell you about the poverty, how, you know, there's a high rate of infant mortality there. But anyway, so that was the border. And the next day, I had the privilege, after this victory of the people, I had the privilege of meeting with a woman who is the Minister of Penitentiary Service of People's Power. Because the prisons of Venezuela were notorious. Extreme violence, common were massacres by the inmates themselves and by the guards. Very, very severe repression. Many of the inmates had their own weapons. In one prison, they even had a 50 millimeter machine gun. It was huge. Violence. Drug trafficking. In the women's prison, I met one woman who had been there before the reform of the recent years, and she was pretty young, but she said that the women didn't have uniforms, they had no order, they had no health care, they were just left to themselves, and that the women would engage in knife fights on a regular basis. She said we would get our knives and our blades, we'd get in a circle called Coliseum, and we would just fight. And the one who won was the new leader. And then she talked about how her life and the others were changed by the reform. 2011, Chavez named this ministry. He put Iris Varela in charge. And under President Maduro, because that's when the reform began, it's been completely changed. Doesn't mean, it's like they said, like 98% reformed. But they have work, and they have dignity, and they have peace. And the guards are not armed inside the prison now. You know, how many of you seen like Lockup? How many of you ever seen these prison shows, cop shows? That's it? I thought more people saw those stupid programs. You've seen them. You've seen them where they go in when someone's maybe had a psychological breakdown, and then 4 or 5 big men come in with tasers and beat the hell out of them, or put them in these straitjackets to just get more upset. You know, I saw something the other day. There was a young black man who decided to turn himself in for a DUI charge. Did you see that? He was found dead like 2 days later in jail, and his brain, his throat, and his heart are missing from the body. It's in the news. Read the Washington Post. And the family's like, what happened to his body? But anyway, excuse me for diverting. It's not really diverting. We know what our prison system is like. When you don't have guards that are armed in a prison, think about it. Because they always say like, oh, we have to protect ourselves from the prisoners. But it shows you that there is mutual respect when the guards aren't worried about the prisoner and vice versa. And that the guards don't have a weapon to brutalize someone when they don't do what they want is called education, persuasion, and giving them dignity and real rehabilitation. So we're going to watch that video. Is that okay? Oh, first we'll watch Iris Varela, the woman who talks about the contraband. I know it's a lot in this program, but this is an education. You won't see it anywhere else. And then we'll show the prison. Okay? And then we'll have questions and answers.